All right, so today we're going to continue on with what we had been doing last week, which was we were working with our gas can. And what I want to do today is show you some additional tools that you can use, to make or model things as we've been doing. Some things that we haven't touched on at all. And as we are kind of working on our gas can, let me hide some of these things. I've got a bunch of lights in my scene. And I use the wireframe a lot so you can kind of see the basics. And I was looking at, most of you got the basic shapes of the model. Now I used edge loops to hold the geometry of my object tight around the corners. I didn't crease it. I did add some faces on the front. Well, I didn't add faces. I just scaled down and made this extrusion for this rim that goes around the actual front of the model right here, this area here. So I actually did that in geometry on my model. You could use a bump map to do that too. You could maybe get by with making it a separate piece of geometry, but for this I mostly just selected faces and scaled them down and then extruded those out. Now what I want to talk about today is a few additional tools that you can use to create objects like this lid. This is basically just a cylinder that I extrude faces out of the edges. What you end up doing is, you need to know how many of these extensions you're going to have so that you can have that number of faces around your cylinder to go every other one and pull it out. Does that make sense? Because I'm just going to skip the faces at the low polygon and then just extrude them out as a cylinder, or just extrude them out and basically keep them fairly simple. But that itself is not super complex. It's just a cylinder with a lot of faces that I extruded. The part that I want to talk about is when we are creating more complex shapes like this spout with these, and then adding some or using some tools to create deformities a little bit, to deform a model in a way. So this model actually has a little curved deformer on it that's giving it a little bit of a curvature, and it's something you can use. And I also used what's called a curve, or a NURBS curve, to create a shape to which then I can revolve it around a center point. And I want to talk a little bit about that today because it's something that can come in super handy when you are making organic shapes. For example, maybe a wine glass or something, or we've been making things by extruding down loops and shrinking them, scaling them in or out. Maybe when I did railings and that sort of stuff, when I was creating like a chair and the leg of the chair had different geometry on it, and I used a cylinder and I just kind of put in places. There's other ways to create models or forms like that that can be a little bit easier. Well, I won't say easier, but it's just a different way to do it. And that's what I want to show you today, a little bit of that. So I'm going to start with a new scene here. And I want to introduce a couple things. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to use the idea of using an object. We're going to use a curve to create or control the shape of a surface. So what that means is that we're going to have a curve that has history, or we're going to have a surface that has history connected to another object that defines its shape. If I define or if I modify one part of the shape or the curve, it will actually modify the surface until we do what's called delete history, when we break those connections. Remember, I had said that objects have nodes. Maya is built on nodes where we have some information that feeds into other information that feeds into other information. So in this case, we have information that defines a curve, which we'll create on our own. Then that curve is going to be connected to a material or the geometry, and then from that we can modify things a little bit. So what I want to do is kind of show you how this works. And when you do this, you need to work in an orthographic view. So I'm going to work in my front view here so I can see everything. And I want to give myself some space. And what I want to do is we're going to just kind of do a very basic example here. We have to work along our axes. So I'm going to work along my axis here. Start where the 0, 0, 0 is in the middle of the, or is the beginning of the world, basically, the center. And I want to define a shape that is around it. And what's going to happen is we'll actually revolve around that point. So remember, let me show you something. Remember, our objects have insertion points, or what's called a pivot point. This cube has a pivot point, right? It's in the middle of the object, in the center. If I hit the insert key, I can actually move that insertion point to a different location. If I snap it to my grid and hit my insertion point again, this object's insertion point or pivot point is actually located over here. So I'm actually moving that around or orbiting it around that pivot point, but it's no longer the center of the object. Does that make sense? I can rotate this around a different point. We can move that, and if I rotate this way, or if I scale it, let me go in and if I were to scale it from this point, notice that it scales away from this point. And if I want to recenter it, I can go up to Modify, Center Pivot, and it'll put it back in the middle. Notice that when I center it from here, the whole thing scales uniformly. But when I move it to, say, a corner location by hitting Insert and moving it down here, hit my Insert key, notice that it scales from that point and that point up. And you'll see this if you work in Unreal and stuff. A lot of game assets will come in with the pivot point down at the bottom of it so that you can kind of scale it uniformly up so it doesn't scale out in all directions. So you might see something like this when we scale up an object like this. So we can modify and move our pivot point in a lot of different ways, and just to do this. I do this a lot. Just move it to a different point. With this idea, we can create something, a profile of a form with a curve. Now watch, I'm going to demonstrate this for you before you try to do it. Under the Create menu, there is a Curve tool. I'm going to go to the Options box for this. And the Curve tool has a variety of options for it, and I'm using just the 3-qubit right now. And it's going to be allowing me to set, remember I said whenever you have a curve, you have a beginning point, you have a change, and then you have that point in the middle, and it'll draw a curve around. This is going to follow the same idea. Now, what I want to do is I'm just going to make a curved shape. Maybe this is, and I'm going to use the X key, the X button. I'm going to hold it down because it'll snap it to the grid. So watch this. So this is going to be the middle of my object, and I'm going to just start off a little bit to the side. I'm going to click 2, 3, 4. Notice how I have a curve now. And if I create something like this, and I hit enter, I have a curve. That curve is perfectly drawn in my world orthographically on the axes, right? Now what I want to do is I want to create a surface from this, okay? And what I want to do is say, look, take this curve and use it to create a surface. So under my surfaces menu, there are some options that we use for the use of curves. When we use curves to create objects, or when we use curves to create surfaces, we have some different options. I'm going to be using the Revolve method, and I'm going to hit the options box. What the Revolve method wants to do is say, well, which axes are you going to revolve around? Well, we're revolving around the y-axis, not this axis, not this axis, but this. So imagine there's a point right here, and it's going to revolve around it. Okay, so it's going to revolve around this way. Does that make sense? Not this way, not around this way, and not around this way, but this way. And I can say, how much am I gonna? I'm gonna revolve 360 degrees. So imagine this is like creating a, if you ever had a dowel rod and you put it on, what is it, a lathe, and it's spinning, right? It's spinning around, and then you take a sharp cutting device and you remove the wood. And when you do that, you can start to remove and make these beautiful round spindle shapes. So when you push in, you take out more. When you pull out, so you end up making these beautiful kind of round spindles. Does that make sense? Everybody's seen those on their stairs and all that sort of stuff. Same thing if you make drumsticks or other things that need to be that are continuously wound, spun. And how many segments is how many times am I going to take this shape and duplicate it around? So I'm going to duplicate it 8 times around in 360 degrees. And then the output is what kind of object. So I'm going to output it as a polygon. And I'm going to say output it as a quad. And so what it's going to do is I'm going to say apply. And notice quickly it takes that curve, duplicates it around that object, and produces a form. I have an end sweep value that I can open this up, and you can see at 0 degrees all the way around to 360 degrees. I have a start sweep, which starts at the other end and goes around, but there's my profile curve. And here's my tessellation values, and then my revolve values. Then I have the how many sections did it actually build. So as I start to add more and more sections, it'll reduce or kind of reduce the amount of times it goes around my surface. So what I can do is, I'm going to delete that for a sec. What I can do is I can create forms based on this shape. So I was going to do it again. I'll just do a quick example. So I'm using my curve tools, just the CV curve tool. I'm just using the 3 cubic for now. The more, if I use 5, I have to put down 3 points before I get a curve, which means I'd have more control of that curve. I have a little bit tighter uniformity to the curve versus kind of a more general curve, so a more specific. So the more points you have, the higher fidelity it has to the original curve that you draw, whereas 3 is kind of a loose curve. So if I was to just draw starting at the axes here, I'm going to snap it to the axes. And if I was to just kind of do some basic shape, now if I put that in, I'm going to hit my backspace for a second. If I put that in just like that, it's a little bit, I can right click on this and I can do what's called control vertex. So we have in this, because this is not a polygon, this is a curve, it has different names. So a control vertex is the component of this object. So I can go back and I can adjust some of these a little bit. So as I create this, anybody kind of guess what that looks like? Yeah, so it's the profile of a wine glass. So if I go in an object mode, I can take this, I go up to surfaces and I say revolve. I already know my settings are set to revolve around Y, and I'm going to output as a polygon. And so I'm going to go count. And what it'll do, the count looks more like what we're familiar with. It'll create quads for me. And notice that I have a very nice general shape of a wine glass. Now what's interesting is that the curve and the wine glass surface are still connected. So if I modify this curve by simply just moving it away from the axes, so I'm just moving it away from the axis, well, it's just like if I was on a potter's spinning wheel and I start to move the clay and I press out, the pot gets bigger. If I push it in, it gets smaller, right? I don't know if anyone of you ever done that before. Stretching that surface. Also, those vertices, control vertices that I have, that also adjusts the surface. So I can actually go in and make changes to the shape of my profile by moving these points around. So right now they are connected through what's called our history and our input and output values. So I have this surface, which actually I can move the surface, and if I move my control vertices, I can still modify and move in that shape around. So using some of these to create forms is kind of a nice tool. Now when it gets complicated, this doesn't have any thickness. It's just a very thin, obviously a very thin sheet of material. So let's try making a little curve here, just so that you can kind of see how it works. So we're going to go into our Create menu. And we're going to go to our Curves tool, and we're just using the CV Curve tool. There's a variety of curve tools, but this makes it a clean curve. We don't have too many points. So I'm going to just say CV Curve tool options box. My options box pops up. I'm going to, if you want to, you can reset tool, and by default it sticks with the 3 cubic. And I'm going to say I can minimize this, or I can close this window, and I get this little crosshair in my my viewport here, and I'm just going to use my grid to create my shape. So you could start at the bottom or you could start at the top. If you want your surface to be closed, you want it to touch the axes. So I would want, if I'm going to make a wine glass, I'm going to use my X key, and I'm going to hold down the X key to snap to the grid. Notice that this little icon illuminates when I hold down. I'm holding down my X key, so it's like a toggle switch to say snap to grid. And I'm going to snap it to my 000 vertex, right, or grid point right there. Then I'm going to release, and I'm simply going to click 1, 2, 3, and don't worry if this is messy. I'm just going to kind of click, and I'm not going to do too many. And then I think about where my curve is going to be, and I'm going to just click a little bit more and a little bit more. So this is the stem of the glass, and I don't need too many points. I just want to hold that curve, and I'm going to do another transition right here. So I always do 3 parts when I start to do a curve, and then I can expand a little bit. Then I'm going to do another one up. So there's my curve, and I can go up and up. And just as a basic little curve like this, I have a base. Then I have my stem, or the base, or the neck. I don't even know what that part of a glass is called, the neck or the stem. Then the body of the glass. So this is more like a margarita than a wine. If I right click on there, I can use the control vertex to clean it up. So if I don't like the way that looks, I can use that to smooth things out and adjust if I need to. And so don't feel like you're locked into anything, because you're not. You can move this to be the shape that you prefer. If I want to grab a bunch like these and make it shorter and do this, so you can do anything. You can do a lot with, you can do a lot with it. So don't feel like you're locked in. All right, most importantly, you want to make sure that this one at the beginning is touching that is touching the vertex there. Otherwise you'll have a hole in your cup. Okay? So now I'm going to go right click and say object mode, because I need to actually use the curve as my object to rotate. And I'm going to go up to surfaces because I'm using a curve to make a surface. So the surfaces is going to be created from my Revolve tool. I'm going to go to my options box just to make sure I have the y-axis selected. My end sweep angle is 360 degrees. We want it to sweep all the way around 360 degrees. The default is 8 segments, which is fine. My output geometry is going to be polygons because we haven't talked about NURBS or any of these other surface types. And I'm using what's called the type of quads because I don't want triangles. I don't want a bunch of triangles. We want quads. Everything we've been doing so far is quads. And then the count is the number of polygons it's going to create to do this. And this is going to be 200 quad polygon count. And I can adjust and lower that to reduce that amount, but this will be a decent enough shape. So I have a quad because I want everything to be squares, not triangles. And the count I can add, and it makes nice connected geometry that doesn't have any poles in it, and I'll show you the difference. So if I hit apply, it revolves that surface around my object.
Can you do that again?
Sure.
What did I do?
All right, let me show you again. So I have my curve. I'm going to go to Surfaces, Revolve, Options box. I'm going to edit, I'm going to reset my settings. I'm going to say Axis Preset. The one I want to revolve around is Y. So I'm on my Y axis here. I'm going to revolve around Y. The end sweep angle is 360. I'm not changing that. My segments is 8. I'm not changing that. The output, though, I'm going to change to polygon right here. And the type is not going to be triangles. It's going to be quads. We work with quads. And the tessellation method is going to be count. And by default, it's going to give me 200. And I'm just going to leave it like that. And I'm going to hit apply. Now look what happens if I choose the wrong axis. So if I go up and I choose the wrong axis and I say apply, if I say apply, it's rotating it around the x-axis. Although that makes a great sink, if I want to make a sink strainer or something, that's perfectly fine for that. But it's using this shape, but it's rotating it around that. If I were to take this shape and rotate it around z, it'll just be a flat mess. But it is still taking that shape and rotating it. You can see the profile of that shape. So if you get different shapes like that, if you get weird behaviors, you want to make sure you are revolving around the proper axes. Now remember, in our channel box, we have these values. I have the revolve input values right here, and I can increase or decrease the sections. I can, under tessellate, I can actually go and adjust some of those values. If I reduce some of these values to lower values, less than 200, you can see how the polygon count is reduced. But I don't typically want to do that later. So my revolve information is all right there. And remember that my curve is actually still right there. So I'm going to select both the curve and the object, hold down Shift, and then reselect my material, or my surface, and then I see my curve is right there. Is everybody able to do that?
What did I do?
I deleted my whole thing on accident.
So to get that curve, I'm going to select both and then deselect by holding down Shift and dragging on my surface so I can see that curve. And then I can hold my mouse on my curve and go to Control Vertex, and then I can modify the shape of my cup and I'm using the wireframe so you can see kind of it. So there, now I've made a margarita glass, I think. And so let me pause and see if, okay. I want you to practice a little bit understanding the curves. And so how you make, that's not what I want. Let me see this here. Hold on a second. So get a feel for creating the curves and so you don't put too many in. So if you want a nice broad curve, first of all, you always have to have 3 points. So there's my first 3, and then when I add another one, it gives me this nice general curve, right? Which is very nice if you want to just create a nice flowing kind of curvature. Now, I'm going to hit my backspace and I can remove some of those. If I want more of a tight curve, I will put those points closer together. So as they're closer together, I can get more fidelity on the curvature of something. The farther apart they are, the more broad that curve can be. Does that make sense? So you want to kind of, you don't want to you don't want to necessarily put in way too many points. It's not necessary unless you need a super, the fidelity of that curve to be that tight. So just when I do it, I think, where am I going to, what's an expanse? So for instance, I can go from here. This is basically straight, but the minute I want to start turning, that's going to be where I'm going to put in my curve, my tight curve here. And I typically try to just hit the spots across from one another. So like here's a point, here's a point, and then go up. If I need a tighter curve here, I can do that. If I need a general curve, I can do that. So I don't have to have a lot of geometry, and then so that's one thing to kind of look, and then just look at, if I move things around, if I space things out, what happens with it. So don't be afraid to just spend some time experimenting with how these things behave and how it affects my curve. Okay? Don't be afraid to do that. So for instance, if I wanted to grab all of these and say scale them down in Y to kind of clean them up, what would that do to my curve? And if I wanted to grab all of these and scale them down, they should already be, or maybe these, what would it look like? And if I took that one here and I scaled it down, I don't think we spend enough time experimenting and trying to really understand the behaviors of the model. So I encourage you to spend time not so much trying to accomplish something, but more trying to understand it. What is it doing? So that when you do want to make something, you have a better idea of the behavior and the outcome that you're going to get because you've experimented a little bit. If I hit delete, I can delete one of those if I don't need it. So if I don't need it, don't keep it. Does that make sense? I just hit the delete key to get rid of a CV or a control vertex. So just kind of experiment a little bit with the outcomes and just see what you get. So one practical application of this curve tool is to do just what we're doing. We create a profile of something, a glass, a mug, or something more complex like this spout. So if we were going to make a spout for this gas can, and I didn't want to start with a cylinder and kind of grab a bunch of things, so I just have to kind of think which one's going to be the easiest for me to understand or accomplish. So if I take a cylinder and I add a bunch of additional components to it and its height, and I adjust the height of it and I add height, can I get what I want out of that by grabbing edges? And let's say if I went in and grabbed some edges, maybe a whole series of maybe this one, and then this one, and then this one. The tighter they are, well, I would probably do it one at a time like this. And then if I scaled that out, if I scaled that in, could I get the job done by doing this faster? Or could I solve it by using maybe rotate a curve? Maybe if I went in and I said create curve, if I went into my CV curve and I said, okay, I want a spout. It's going to be about so big. This is going to be the beginning of it, maybe right here. And then, now this is going to end up being maybe a little more rounded than I want. And if I ended up, and it might take me some time to kind of figure it out, and it might not work at all. But maybe by thinking about it, trying to solve this idea, this idea of could I, oops, and then if I wanted it to look like it has some thickness, maybe I just do something like this. Oops, wrong button. Now I might need more or less components. I might want to put them together. Tighten them. But the idea is if I can think about it in one way versus another, I might be able to accomplish it faster doing this. If I were to revolve this around Y, oops, it may work, it may not work. Planar trim, oh, that's not planar, revolve. This is what I want. Thank you. So I can get a surface that might be a little closer. Maybe it gets me a little closer. Maybe it didn't turn out the way that I want. But it is something that I might be able to go back to and make some modifications on. Don't want to extrude. So it's just one way to think about something. And if I had a surface like this, let me show you another tool that's really handy. Before we move on to something else, I want to show you another way to use curves that is really, really pretty amazing. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to demonstrate with a simple cube. All right, so I have a simple cube, and I'm going to get rid of my grid for a second. Now I'm in my front view, and because I'm in my front view, I can create a curve with my curve tool. And what I want to do is say, all right, I want to take a face, and I want this face to extrude along a path. Maybe I want it to go from this face and extrude along here and end up over there. Maybe it's a tentacle, maybe it's a sidewalk, maybe it's just a path or something like that. Maybe it's a chimney. All right. So what I can do is because I have this path and this face, I'm going to hide this. I can take it and say, look, I have this. I'm going to right click. I have my curve selected. I'm going to right click on my object. I'm going to right click on my object and say face. I'm going to choose the face. So I have to have the curve and the face that I want to work on selected, right? Now when I go, this is actually curving up, so that's fine. If I were to say extrude right now, it would extrude along this path. But what it does is it only creates one division and it puts it at the end. Notice how the extrusion ended at the tip of my curve. Now I drew the curve from the beginning of where it should start to the end, not the other way around. If I started here and drew it to the face, it would be a complete mess because it would try to start the curve there and go out this way. But watch as I add divisions, as it starts to have more geometry, it starts to follow that path, like it's extruding towards and along that path. And the more extrusions that I have, the smoother that path gets. Now I also have some extrusion attributes, such as a taper option. So if I wanted to taper it, I can taper it down to 0, which actually tapers down to like a point. I can twist it, which will actually rotate that around the surface a little bit. So 180 degrees, 250 degrees. So that's pretty cool. And if I were to smooth that, you can see the geometry flows. So one thing that we can use this for is, right now we might have a coffee mug that needs a handle. Well, we can have a face coming off of our coffee mug, and we can draw a curve, a nice uniform, beautiful curve that we take time. Instead of having to extrude up and then out and then over and then down, and then you just take that and you extrude that out. Does that make sense? What's beautiful is I still have that curve inside of there. So I can take that, get rid of that. Sometimes it's tricky to grab these objects. So I can actually still move that and adjust that object with that curve. And if I use my buttons, my right arrow and my left arrow, I can transverse down the curve and make little tweaks to my geometry just by modifying or moving down the curve if I want. So if I wanted it to curve this way, I could do that without having to dig into it and try to select it. So left arrow up the curve, right arrow down the curve. That makes sense? If we had more complex objects made up of those, we could actually, but that's another type. This is called a NURBS, N-U-R-B-S curve, a NURBS curve. We can make NURBS surfaces. We're not going to do that in here. But a NURBS curve is a mathematical curve, so it's not polygonal. That's how we get this nice curve. That's why we have a much more organic shape versus a 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.3 straight lines. But what's beautiful about it is that we can end up with some pretty nice looking things. All right? So an application of this could be, let's say we have an object. Let me show you how I would do a really quick demo of something, of a little cup. So I have a little cup here. So here's what I'm looking at when I'm thinking about this. First of all, I'm looking at the faces that are in alignment with my axes. I have 20 subdivisions. If I did 8 subdivisions, notice that my axes, if I wanted to use a face for extrusions, notice that they're at angles from my geometry. So this face is going off this way and going off this way. If I said 10, I have a face that is going in alignment. So I could use 10. I'm going to use 20 at the moment. So here's 20, and I can pull out faces in one axis or another. So I'm going to make a coffee cup handle using a curve that's going to come off of the top of it and down. Okay? And you can practice this on your own. But let me show you how I would make a coffee cup fairly quickly. If I went into face, sorry, I'm going to hop around in different views. And if I selected, say, half of this, and I just said goodbye, and if I went into object mode and I took this object and I Control-D, duplicated and scaled down just a tiny little bit, I take this geometry because it's basically the same thing. I've scaled it down a little bit, but it's black. Notice how the inside is black? That's because it thinks the inside of the cup is the outside, or is the inside, and this is the outside. Well, I want to be able to see the inside, like this is the surface, so this is where the light is being hit, but that's not doing me any good. I want to reverse that. So under Mesh Display, we have what's called normals. We will reverse those. So now I have gray on the inside of my cup. I don't want it to be on the, I don't care. I want to be able to see that. So it's basically saying this is the part of the surface that the camera is looking at. That's where the light is hitting it, right? The other way around, it was this black void. The light was being on the inside of my cup. So now I have two surfaces. And I'm going to say combine, because I'm going to just combine them together. And now I have two edges that I'm going to, what am I going to do?
Connected.
How?
Spot weld.
No.
Bridge it.
Yes. Bridget. You know Bridget. Here is my Bridget. And because it's kind of, I didn't do a very good job of lining it up, I'm going to go back here, select those. I'm going to or deselect those. And because those top ones are flat, I'm going to flatten them down. So I just basically made them flat. So now I have these faces here in the middle, and I could get rid of that extra division if I want to. And then what I have is, now what I want to do is think about, I'm going to extrude, and this is, and I might do this. So here are four faces. And typically when I start working on things, when we start making like holes in objects, what I typically do is think of a hole as 8 points. So it'll make a nice round circle. And so a hole, like I might be doing here, can come from what's called just a planar extrusion down. Now what I'm kind of worried about is my tension on this surface, so I'm already thinking about that a little bit. But what I can do is if I extrude down a little bit, watch what happens. I'm just going to extrude this down and this in a little bit. Now, I haven't disturbed the surface too much, but watch. Vertex here, there are 8 vertices in this place that go around this. Because I've extruded it in, I get an extra loop in here, an edge right there. So I have this ring that goes around, and these 8 vertices are what would make up a very nice hole, because a hole, you want it to be round, and the nicest hole is typically like a stop sign. Well, I can quickly make a nice stop sign shape by just taking these 4 corners and extruding them down uniformly and in a little bit. You'll see that stop sign shape right there? That makes a nice, usually makes a nice hole. If you wanted to put a hole where a button would go, like on your whatever device, you have a face, you make 4 faces, extrude them uniformly in, you created basically a nice little set of edges that go around the outside, and then you have this nice little hole on the inside. Now you can shape that as best you can, and typically I will shape it. I'm get these things out of my way. Oops. And just kind of go with that. Now what I want to do is I'm going to take this point, I'm just going to mark it here so I can see it, and what I want to do is make a little curve. I'm going to create a curve tool, and from this point, and I should be looking at a reference. I should know where I'm going to end, but you can kind of see, I'm going to put on my wireframe shading. So I have basically a point here that will, these faces can extrude out, and then I'll terminate down here in these faces. Let's see where, right here. So I'm just going to do a single extrude in here, just very slightly, not too much. All right, and tweak those. So I'm going to choose these faces here, and I need my curve. Actually, I should do that. I like to do it this way. I'm going to select my curve, right-click on my object. Sorry, right-click on my object, choose face, and then I'm going to see what we get. I may have to fix some things, but let's see what happens. So what am I trying to do? I'm trying to extrude. So I'm going to extrude along this path, and because it doesn't have any divisions in it yet, it wants to jump just straight down to the edge. And I can start to add more and more geometry here, however I need, to kind of get the look that I want. You see what I did? So I quickly pulled off that edge, and because this face down here is illuminated, I'm going to grab those, and if I delete them, I have a nice little tube, and then I can connect that here. I should, so these edges, actually if I just double click that, I have a nice little edge. If I double click this, I have a nice little edge. And then what are we going to do? Who's our favorite connection? Bridge it. Bridge it. All right, there we go. I bridged it. Wasn't that nice? Wasn't that more painless than trying to extrude down and around? And what's nice is I can go back and readjust my curve. Well, don't do it don't do it. Settle down, settle down. Grab them both. Deselect that one. Go in. You got to be on the curve. This is not particularly, but the point is, I can move that around and I can shape that however I want to make it whatever, unique, fit my fingers, whatever. All right. So there's an application of using the curve tool to help you do some stuff like that. And like the spout. So the spout on the gas can, in the example that I used here, I did a quick little curve. Oh, don't delete your object, but it's right up here. I'm going to frame that. I took some time, and it's pretty ugly, but you can kind of see that I have this zigzagged point, and then from that I revolved it and I made this. Now it wasn't perfect. I had to modify it a little bit, but I did end up adding, it did end up turning out okay. Didn't love it, not in love with it, but you get the idea. Does that make sense? It's not magic. You got to put in some time to get the shape the way you want. And so the other thing that I did is to create a little bit of a curve to this. And I'm actually using the same thing here. Do you notice how this plane, this is just a flat plane with the curve, it's actually connected to a deformer. And the deformer is actually, it's actually controlling that shape a little bit. And I can actually lay it down and control it and modify that curve with a little curvature control. So it takes that geometry and it actually modifies it and gives it a little bit of curvature. So I'll show you how you can use that just in a little bit. If you do have something that you need to curve, you could just use the curve tool, but sometimes, or use the create the curve tool. But this is called a bend deformer. So I'm going to show you that because you might want to use that just to tweak things a little bit. I'm gonna use it on a cube. Now the thing is with these types of deformers, you have to have geometry. You have to have edges to move it because this is just a block, right? It has a block with no components to move. So I can't bend something like this because there's nothing to bend. There's nothing to bend. It needs edges. So if I were to take something like this, and I'm just going to scale him up a little bit so it'll make more sense and be a little bit more interesting. And if I add divisions on him in height like this, I have something I can actually bend. And it's a fairly simple thing to do. It's not particularly complicated, but it does help. So instead of trying to rotate or go in and move components and all that sort of stuff, which would be very difficult to do, we have some basic deformers that we'll work with in a much more detailed when you get into animation. But they can be very helpful for small adjustments in your shapes. These are called nonlinear deformers. So I'm in the deformer menu, and they're called nonlinear, and there's bend, flare, sine wave, squash, twist, wave. If you've heard of animation, you use squash and what is it? Squash and what?
Stretch.
Oh, right. Squash and stretch. Yeah, so squash and stretch, bend. We're gonna do a bend. So what it does, you don't see anything, but actually it put a control object inside of inside of here. And it's given me inputs over here in my inputs called bend 1. Bend 1 has a variety of attributes. The curvature one is the one that's going to bend my object. Notice that it is now curving my object from both the bottom and the top. See how it's curved like a C? The low bound will define one portion of it. So it's say, you know what? You're not going to be able to move that lower section, so I'm turning that off. I only want you to be able to curve that upper part. So the low bound value can be adjusted. The high bound value can be also adjusted as well. Same thing, I can turn that off, or turn it on. And the envelope value is kind of like the influence that it has on it. So I can kind of turn up the volume or not. And I can also take the control and I can move it a little bit and kind of get different things as well. So I can kind of move it around. You can kind of see what happens if I accidentally do that. I can also rotate it. So if I wanted it to go that way, then I can move this in 90 degrees to rotate in that area. So adding a slight deformer to something, such as the spout, can be a helpful thing to do if I can't model it in place. Another deformer that might be helpful is a nonlinear deformer called flare. Flare might work. It's just going to be added. The flare will give you the ability to kind of flare out something. You can see how it has. This might be good for a breathing creature of some sort, but you can see how it's flaring out the geometry. You might want, when we model things, sometimes we want to model things very rigidly, and then we might use a deformer like this to give us a little more form, a little more shape after we model it kind of in kind of more of a linear format. It has the high and low bound values, so you can adjust. So if somebody swallows something and it goes down their throat, you can kind of move that. Right? So you can change the shapes of things. And again, it has the different flares, so I can make it flare out a lot more. Or anyway, you'll get into this in 188 when you start working with cartoons and characters and controlling your objects. But for general form adjustments in a minor little kind of way, say we wanted to adjust that gas can to have more of a flare to it in one part of it, instead of having to go in and adjust everything, you might try shaping or sculpting. Think of these more like a sculpt tool. And they're over here in my inputs. And the thing is, if I want to keep that shape, if I were to delete this right now, when it's gone, the effect it has on the shape is gone. What I have to do if I want to keep it is delete the history, delete the effect that this is having, and basically just freeze it. So I'm going to say I have my P cube, and I have to edit what's called history, delete by type history. Then that object is gone, and now I'm frozen that way. So it took the influence that it was having and it froze it there and said this is how it's going to stay forever because I deleted the history and it's stuck. So I can't change anything now. But when that object is there, I can make adjustments. So this is still feeding into the overall look of my object. Does that make sense? So that's one way to add some changes or add some kind of some changes, or I kind of think of them like sculpting a little bit. All right. I'll take a little break. All right, so I'm just going to walk through this one more time just to get the workflow when we are creating curves and faces. Everyone seems to be getting on the right path. So if I have an object and I want to extrude a certain portion of it along a path, I'm going to, first I want to work orthographically, meaning I want to make sure I'm working in a straight orthographic line. Just makes the life so much easier. So I'm going to be working, say, on these faces here, for example. And so let's say I want to draw, maybe it's going to have something come out from there. And so I want to actually make sure I'm working here. It's on the side. And if I make a curve, I'm just going to go to my curve tools. And there's a variety, again, there's a variety of these. The 3 is the default. And if I were to just create a little curve here, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but here's my curve. The faces that align with those are basically going to be, right in this area. So I'm going to say these, and these. Now I can use these faces, and I want to bring up this curve here. And then if I simply just hit the extrude button, it's just going to jump all the way down. If I go into the options box for the extrude options, I can preset these things by saying the divisions. Well, 20 is a good starting point. So I could say make the divisions here 20. I could adjust some of these other things if I wanted to. And if I said apply, then I get those divisions already added, and I can decide whether they're enough or not as I go on. So if I wanted to do that, that's just a quick way to do it. The one thing you want to know is when you connect, if I am going to connect this down to these faces, I want to make sure I delete these faces so that there's not a face in this. It's going to be this nice big tube. So if I were to look in here, I have this nice tube archway, and I could actually fly through this all I wanted if I wanted to do that. You should be able to fly through your model and not have any dead ends. Like I shouldn't fly into a wall like this. There's a wall right there. It should be a nice open thing. If I wanted to, I could also do this by choosing the edges. I can actually take these edges as well. And oops, looks like I deleted my curve. I could take these edges and extrude the edges of this as well along this curve, and do similar things. 20 is a nice spot. So, and then I end up with no faces here, and then I can just delete the faces and bridge. Does that make sense? That's another way to do it. A lot of times people forget, and they have lamina faces. They have the faces on the beginning and the faces on the other part, and then they weld them together or connect them, and then you have extra geometry, and it doesn't look quite right because it has tension there that we don't want. Let me talk about the creating holes in surfaces. What I want to show you is, and it probably, I could do it on this, but I'm going to do it on a cube for now. So here is a basic cube, and one of the things that we have a lot is we will have objects with holes in them. Maybe it's a remote control or whatever it is, and a lot of times people don't actually make the holes. They just put a cylinder and say there's the button. But if you look at anything, there's a hole there because this is on a spring and this is an object going into a hole. You know what I mean? And there's actually space around the button where the button part, the little button thingy goes into, right? So we make holes. So if I needed this to have holes in it and I'm actually going to make geometry, it's typically not just deleting a face. Usually we have, what I was going to say is, we'll have 8 points. 8 points is kind of like the standard for creating a hole. So I need 8 points in this space right here. Now I could do this actually. I could just delete these And what I typically do is shape these corner points a little bit to create more like an octagon. So there's a really quick and easy way to make a hole, right? And then I take these edges and then extrude them in a little bit. I'm going to reset my settings because I know that my extrusion's got 8 subdivisions, or no, it did. Reset, apply, close that, and I'm just going to push that in like so. And if I wanted to, I could then extrude that in one more extrusion, and you can kind of see how that can make a nice hole in my object. Creates a nice little space right there. Another way that I tend to do it is to do something like this. Go into my faces, and then I will do an extrude down. So notice that I'm going to actually extrude this uniformly down. Like, see, that's my reset settings. See how it's stuck like that? Don't want that. 20 divisions. I thought I reset that. So I'm going to choose this. I want to go up to my extrude. I'm going to reset my settings, not 20. And I'm going to do a nice uniform extrusion down like this. Okay? Then I'm going to shape this a little bit. One of the ways I can shape this is by a cheap way to do it is just to kind of take all of these. I'm just going to grab all these like so and scale it down a little bit. And then I could take these outer edges or these outer corners and just kind of expand them out, or bring them in, and make like a little stop sign. Does that make sense? Everybody see that? Then this face here can be basically that's the hole, and then I can extrude that in a little bit. And that can give me a really beautiful hole there as well. I can close this one off. But basically, it's a different way to do it. This holds my hole a little bit tighter when I extrude it down versus this one is kind of a big space. But what's nice is when I add, let me get a hold of this one, doesn't want to. If I were to add a little bit of a crease to this, these pop-ups, oh, come on. When I get a little bit of a crease to it, it provides a very nice edge. To my model. And if I were to smooth that, turn off that, you can see it gives you a really nice hard edge that looks quite good. If I were to smooth that down and add some more divisions on it, it holds its shape very nicely. Can you see that? That's a very nice indentation right there. Another thing that they've added, this is kind of a new feature, and it is kind of handy if you are, so if I'm going to do kind of the same thing I just did. So I'm going to choose these faces, and I'm going to extrude them in a little bit. I'm going to, like so. And one of the things that Maya has added over the years is, because I've been doing it this way for a long time, where I'd be kind of making my own circle. And what it's given us is actually a new, I was like, I'm going to write this script that's going to take a bunch of points that I grab and make a circle out of it. Well, they actually did that. So they have a tool that is called Circularize. And it actually will do just that. If I grab these components like this and say circularize, boom, they already do it. So it instantly makes that perfect circle. Instead of me trying to do it up here, just kind of getting it as is, you'll get a perfect circle, and then you can then take those components here again and extrude them in like I just did, and you can make a nice, saves you a step. So someone already wrote that for me. Go ahead.
Where was the circularize?
Circularize is under Edit Mesh, Circularize. Isn't that a great name? Circularize.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, so that's a handy thing. So many of you are making objects that have holes in them, buttons and knobs and stuff like that. This is one of the things that we've kind of got to kind of put those spaces in for those holes for those objects. So again, this is something I do all the time, constantly making holes like this because you need to in a lot of objects. They have holes. And then just kind of going through. Another thing, when you, I don't know if you, sometimes you've got to, think about if you have a whole bunch of holes. Let's say you had a bunch of holes in sequence, and instead of making a bunch of them, say this has a bunch, let's say like this remote control has a whole bunch in sequence, right? I don't necessarily want to go in and model every single hole, what I might try to do is make a panel of holes that I can then duplicate and kind of attach as panels. And I did that as an example, only I did it in the that Rush video. So let me not. I'll show you what I mean. So you might take like a plane of some sorts. Let me just give you an idea. So if I was to, let's say I needed multiple holes, I could maybe make myself a bunch here. And I could just make one. Actually, if I was super smart, which obviously, I just make one and then just attach them, right? Or bridges between them, and then duplicate that, then duplicate that, then duplicate that, and make a big string of them. So I could quickly do that. Does that make sense? So yeah, if I was at home after I already did it wrong 10 times, and then I would do that, right? And so let's say these are holes. Actually, I'm already, but you get the idea. So I make a bunch of holes. And go through that process. And what I could do is I could take that panel, Control duplicate it, say those have holes in them, and I could just move that. And then I have these two, right? And then I could attach them. I'm going to turn on my wireframe so you can see them. So these have, pretend these all have just the holes in them. And then I have these edges that I could combine, or I could weld them together. We could combine these two objects. Combine these two objects. So under Mesh, Combine, right? And then I can fill in these two spaces here and there. And then I could bridge those and basically just make a nice space. And then I have that, and then I take that and I duplicate that. So now I'm quickly making a big long strip of buttons or holes or whatever. Does that make sense? And I don't have to do it 1,000 times. And then if I get that, then I could take those and duplicate those and then go up with it. And then once I have those, I take those and then I go up with all those. So I attach them, make a bigger panel, and then attach those, make a bigger panel, and then kind of build up that point so I don't have to just constantly keep doing it. Does that make sense? So then you have a big kind of like I said, a panel of things. So sometimes working with stuff like this where you're doing the same process over and over and over again, if you can't script it or make it something that you can write a script for, a quick little piece of code, and you have to maybe make one or two and then duplicate those over and over again. So that's kind of one thing. A lot of the things that we are working on have that sort of thing, duplication. Another issue, so last time we were working on models that were pretty complicated, or many of you had objects that were very complicated, and in your applications and in your journals you said, I saw this and I wanted to model it, and you're like, I quickly realized it was very difficult. Because what happens is, every object is made up of lots of little objects. So you have whatever it is, it's got knobs, buttons, extrusions or extensions, or it's almost like it was made up of a bunch of different things that somehow miraculously they were formed together. Well, it's not always super easy to recreate that geometry, especially not when you've only been doing this for 4 weeks, right? I mean, we're 4 weeks in. So focus on things that are a little more, a coffee cup probably wouldn't be enough, but something a little more challenging. That's why I like the ideas of remotes, or something that's maybe a little square, or maybe add a few guitar pedals and stuff like that. Those are fairly good ideas because there's a lot of these types of shapes. They're more square. They're a little less organic. They're not made up of a whole bunch of other things. Like a camera has got 25 buttons and all these organic different components. There's too much there to try to model in the amount of time that we have with the skills that we have, right? They're all different parts. So I mean, just to model one part of it would be a model in itself, And so we've got to kind of go back and rethink. It can't be too complex. It has to, like I said, toys. Even some toys would be too complicated. But I don't want you to get into it too far and then realize, oh, I can't do this, or it's too much. So some things I think you don't know until you get in, and it's kind of the individual too. Some of you have more advanced skills than others, and some of you might struggle with something very, just the very basic components. I'm not trying to say anyone can or can't accomplish that. It's the amount of time that you have and the amount of skills that you have. And then really it's a lot of time that you have. You'll notice that a lot of it it takes a long time. People work 4 or 5 hours on something and then throw it away because it didn't go anywhere. And that's normal. I've had the same thing, work many, many, many hours on something to realize I either didn't know I didn't approach it the proper way from the beginning, or it just was too complex and I didn't have time to do all the little things. This isn't supposed to be so complex, and it's definitely not something with lots and lots of components that go along with it. So that makes it complicated. We're going to be modeling for the rest of the lab and I believe on Wednesday, because I want to see where you're at on the models that you are working on, so I can help as much as possible to solve problems and to help you approach each one of your objects the best that we can. Does that make sense? So I need to see where you're at. I need to see your models so I can help. I'm loving the journal. I'm loving the application study because I can see what people are doing and getting more and more feedback directly from what what you're working on at home, and that's helping me kind of gauge what you're struggling with and what your abilities are. I mean, I've seen many of you have like little side projects, and I think that's great to see a lot of stuff like that. But it's also helping me to help you as best I can as well. So we're going to go ahead and go into lab now, and you can work on these skills, basically making sure you can create curves, making sure you can create the basic shapes, and apply some of these things the best you can before we go. And then Wednesday we're going to be modeling in class on your project. That does not mean it's a skip day. That means it's actually the day you want to come and work really, really, really hard, because I'm going to be here to try to help as much as possible on whatever you're having trouble with. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. Go ahead and break into lab.